The air in the SM Mall of Asia was a thick, humid soup of perfume, fried food, and floor polish. Frank's shirt, a Hawaiian print he'd bought specially for the trip, was already sticking to his back. He didn't care. He steered the shopping cart with one hand, his other arm draped possessively around Annalyn's shoulders. She was a tiny thing, barely reaching his armpit, and she'd press into his side at random intervals, a gesture that sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated victory through his chest. Back in Cleveland, a Tuesday afternoon was a silent apartment and the droning inanity of daytime television. Here, it was a carnival. The sheer volume of people, the cascade of Tagalog and English, the glittering storefronts, it was life, cranked up to 11. "You want to get a coffee, sweetie?" Frank boomed, a little too loud. "My treat." Annalyn looked up, her large, dark eyes framed by lashes that couldn't possibly be real, but were. "Oh, Frankie, you are always treating." Her cousin Maricel, who had materialized the moment they'd cleared baggage claim, nodded in vigorous agreement from the other side of the cart. "Nothing's too good for my girl," he said, squeezing her shoulder. He felt like a titan, a provider. At home, his $1,682 monthly Social Security check was a managed decline, a slow slide into irrelevance. Here, it was a king's ransom. He could feel the power of it in the deference of the sales clerks, in the way Maricel's eyes always seemed to find his wallet when she thought he wasn't looking. They settled into a small cafe, the frigid air conditioning a welcome shock. The cart was laden with their spoils, a new rice cooker, "The old one is dying, Tito," Maricel had lamented, bags of groceries heavy with imported hot dogs and a giant tin of Spam, and a pink dress that Annalyn had held against herself in the department store, her bottom lip pushed out in a perfect, calculated pout. As the women chattered, Frank pulled out his phone. It was his scepter, his orb of power. He scrolled past the news headlines warning of inflation back home, a world away, a problem for other people. He opened his banking app, the familiar green and white logo a small comfort. The balance was healthy, freshly topped up by the month's deposit. He'd already mentally earmarked the funds: rent for Annalyn's apartment, which was now his apartment too, utilities, food, and the generous remainder he called the Fun Fund. He felt a small tap on his hand. It was Annalyn. The smile was gone from her face, replaced by a troubled frown. "Frankie," she began, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "Maricel was just telling me. Her mama in the province? She is sick again. The medicine is very expensive now." Maricel stared intently at the sugar dispenser, her expression a mask of filial piety and worry. Frank felt a familiar swell of purpose. This was what he was here for. He wasn't just a retired factory worker from Ohio. He was a benefactor, a white knight. He could fix this. He could wave his magic wand and make the trouble go away. "How much?" he asked, his voice low and firm. Maricel mumbled something in Tagalog to Annalyn. "She says maybe 10,000 pesos?" Annalyn translated, her eyes wide with the gravity of the sum. "About $200, a rounding error on his old car payments." Frank nodded grimly, the magnanimous patriarch. He swiped back to his banking app, his thumb hovering over the transfer button. The phone felt warm in his hand, a direct conduit to the security and happiness he was building here, transaction by transaction. He looked at Annalyn's worried face, at Maricel's downcast eyes, and felt a surge of something more potent than the bitter coffee on the table. He felt needed. The 10,000 peso transfer vanished into the digital ether with a satisfying swoosh. Frank slid the phone back into his pocket, feeling the familiar warmth of a problem solved. Maricel offered a flurry of thank yous, her gratitude so profuse it was almost theatrical. Annalyn rewarded him with a kiss on the cheek that was both chaste and proprietary. For a few minutes, the illusion was perfect. He was the patriarch, the benevolent king, dispensing favor from his throne at a sticky cafe table. Then came the first crack. They were walking past a tech store, its windows filled with glowing screens and sleek devices. Annalyn, who moments before had been a portrait of somber concern for her sick aunt, stopped dead. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at a new model smartphone, a brilliant rose gold that glittered under the mall's halogen lights. "Oh, Frankie, look!" she breathed, her face pressed against the glass. "It's so beautiful. My camera is broken, you know." Frank blinked. The sudden pivot from provincial medicine to flagship electronics was jarring. "Your camera works fine, sweetie. You were taking pictures of the dress an hour ago." "It's not a good camera," she pouted, turning away from the window to face him. The worried expression was back, but this time it was in service of a different crisis. "Maricel's phone is much better. I cannot make nice posts for my friends. It is embarrassing." He felt a strange sensation, a flicker of irritation he quickly suppressed. It wasn't the money. He could probably buy the phone. It was the sequencing, the whiplash. He chalked it up to a cultural difference, a youthful flightiness he was too old to understand. "We'll see," he said, the non-committal answer of a parent, not a partner. He guided her away from the window, but the happy, triumphant feeling from the cafe had been diluted, a drop of bitter in a sweet drink. Later that week, the unease returned. They were at a sprawling family dinner at the apartment, an impromptu affair that had materialized with the arrival of 2 more cousins and an uncle he'd never met. The air was thick with the smell of garlic rice and adobo, and the sound of chatter in a language he couldn't grasp. He sat at the head of the table, a smiling figurehead, nursing a San Miguel and nodding when he thought he should. At one point, Annalyn and Maricel were huddled by the stove, their voices low. He caught his name, Frankie, followed by a quick string of Tagalog. Then he heard it clearly, 10,000. It wasn't the words themselves, but the sound that followed, a stifled giggle, a shared, private joke. He looked over, but they had already composed their faces into neutral masks. He took a long pull from his beer, the cold bottle slick in his hand. It was probably nothing, a misunderstanding. The requests became more frequent and smaller. They lost the dramatic flair of the first one. It was no longer a 5-act play about a dying matriarch. It was a series of footnotes. 500 pesos for a phone card. 1,000 for a new tire on a cousin's scooter. 800 for a contribution to a neighbor's baptismal party. Annalyn would mention them casually, as if she were talking about the weather. The transactions were so small, so insignificant on their own, that to question them would make him seem stingy, a petty tyrant counting his pennies. He was alone one afternoon when Annalyn's old phone, the one with the broken camera she now used as a backup, buzzed on the nightstand. A message preview flashed on the screen. It was from a number he didn't recognize, the text in Tagalog. Frank's curiosity got the better of him. He picked up the phone, his heart thumping. He didn't know the language, but he recognized 2 words instantly, 2 words that had become anchor points in his new life. Frankie and pera, money. He fumbled with his own phone, opening a translation app and awkwardly typing the message in. The result was clunky, grammatically questionable, but the meaning was clear enough. "Did the old man give you the pera for the phone yet? Tell him you need it for your online school, LOL. He will believe anything." Frank stared at the screen, the translated words glowing in the dim light of the bedroom. The air conditioning unit hummed, a relentless, monotonous sound. He put Annalyn's phone back on the nightstand, exactly as he'd found it. He walked into the living room and looked out the window at the tangled mess of power lines and the relentless traffic below. The confident provider who had landed at NAIA a few weeks ago felt very far away. In his place was a man who was starting to suspect that the pleasant-looking cage he'd found wasn't a home, but a business, and he was the only customer. For a full day, Frank said nothing. He carried the translated words in his mind like a shard of glass. "Tell him you need it for your online school, LOL. He will believe anything." The LOL was the cruelest part, the casual, shared contempt. He went about the day, nodding and smiling, the perfect imitation of the man he was pretending to be. He was an actor, playing a fool, and he was beginning to suspect he was the only person who didn't know the name of the play. The performance came 2 days later. Annalyn approached him while he was watching a basketball game on his laptop. She sat on the arm of his chair, her hand tracing patterns on his shoulder. It was the opening gambit, the familiar softening up process. "Frankie," she began, her voice sweet and earnest, "I was thinking, I want to improve myself. For you, for us." He muted the game. "What do you mean, sweetie?" "There is an online course for hospitality management. I could get a certificate. It would be good for my future." She paused, letting the implication hang in the air. Her future, their future. "But I cannot do it with my old phone. The screen is too small and the camera is broken." There it was, the script, delivered almost verbatim. He felt a cold, calm clarity settle over him. He wasn't angry. The time for anger had passed, replaced by a morbid curiosity. He wanted to see how the scene ended. He looked up at her, forcing his face into a mask of gentle regret. "Oh, honey, that's a great idea. It really is. But I just can't swing it right now." Annalyn's hand stopped moving on his shoulder. "What do you mean?" "The budget," he said, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "I just paid the rent and that big transfer for Maricel's mom. I'm running a little tight this month. We'll have to be careful." The change was instantaneous. It wasn't a gradual cooling. It was a switch being flipped. The warmth in her eyes vanished, replaced by a flat, hard appraisal. The soft pout became a thin, tight line. "You have money," she stated. It wasn't a question. "It's not unlimited, Annalyn," he said, his voice still level. "It's a fixed amount. When it's gone, it's gone." She stood up, pulling away from him. The physical distance was a chasm. "My cousin needs a phone for her school, and you will not help her?" The narrative had already shifted. It was no longer about her, but about a nebulous cousin. The lie was disposable. "I thought it was for your school," he said quietly. She didn't even bother to register the correction. It was irrelevant. The negotiation had failed. She walked out of the room without another word. That evening, the apartment was silent. No cousins appeared for an impromptu dinner. The adobo sat cold in the fridge. When Maricel came by to pick up Annalyn to go see a friend, she wouldn't meet his eyes. The deference he had mistaken for respect was gone, replaced by a cool indifference that was far more honest. He was alone, the drone of the air conditioner the only sound. He pulled out his phone, his scepter, his orb of power. It felt like a dead thing in his hand. He opened the banking app, the familiar green and white logo now seeming to mock him. He scrolled past the healthy balance, a balance he now knew was only healthy as long as it was flowing in one direction. He tapped on his transaction history. 10,000 pesos, the price of a hero. 500 pesos, the price of a happy afternoon. 1,000 pesos, the price of a shared smile. Each line item was a receipt for a service rendered. The numbers weren't a record of his generosity. They were a tally of his delusion. He had thought he was a king, a provider, a white knight. But the app, in its cold transactional honesty, told a different story. It showed he was just a customer. A man who had flown halfway around the world to purchase a pleasant-looking cage, only to find out that the affection, like everything else in the mall, was just an item on a shelf with a price tag he could no longer afford. He had not escaped the feeling of being invisible. He had only found a more expensive way to be ignored. The next morning, the silence in the apartment felt less like an absence and more like a presence. It was heavy, functional. Frank sat at the small dining table, nursing a cup of instant coffee, watching the geckos hunt on the ceiling. He hadn't slept, but he wasn't tired. He was lucid. The rage and hurt he'd expected to feel had never arrived. In their place was a quiet, cold understanding, as if a fever had broken. He hadn't been scammed. A scam implies deception, but he had been a willing participant, hungry for the very fantasy they were selling. Annalyn returned in the late afternoon. She didn't offer a greeting or an apology. She walked to the refrigerator, took out a bottle of water, and stood by the counter, drinking. The performance was over. The lights had come up, and the crew was simply clearing the stage. "The electric bill is due," she said, not looking at him. Her voice was flat, a simple statement of fact. There was no story about a sick grandmother needing a light to read by. There was no pout, no soft touch on the arm. It was just a bill, a household expense to be paid by the man of the house. Frank looked at her, at the hard line of her jaw, at the way she refused to meet his eyes. He saw the whole mechanism laid bare, the poverty that fueled her, the loneliness that fueled him, the currency that connected them. He had wanted to feel young and powerful. She wanted to not be poor. It was the most honest transaction he'd been a part of in years. He pulled out his phone. The screen, once a portal to his own personal kingdom, was now just a tool. He opened the banking app. His thumb moved with a practiced, weary efficiency over the transfer button. He punched in the numbers she gave him without question. Her phone buzzed on the counter. A notification of payment received. She nodded once, a clipped, almost businesslike acknowledgement, and went into the bedroom, closing the door behind her. Frank took a sip of his cold coffee. He hadn't bought a fantasy. He had just outsourced his loneliness. He now understood that, like any other utility, the service would continue as long as he kept paying the bill. He was not a king or a hero or even a fool. He was just a budget, and the budget had been approved for another month.